They said he vanished into a mirror, but mirrors only show us what wants to remain seen. I found the apartment on a Tuesday in March, when Berlin was thawing and the streets smelled of wet concrete and yesterday's rain. The building shouldn't have existed, not according to city records, not according to the maps redrawn after reunification. But there it was, wedged between a Turkish bakery and a shuttered cinema, its entrance hidden behind scaffolding that had been there so long it had rusted into permanence. The door opened with a sound like something exhaling, after holding its breath for decades. Inside, the air was different, colder, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there, the cold of abandoned places where human warmth once lived but doesn't anymore. Dripping water somewhere in the walls kept time like a failing metronome. The wallpaper, once perhaps green, perhaps blue, peeled away from the plaster in long strips that curled like dying leaves. A rotary phone sat on a table by the window, its cord severed clean, its dial tone nothing but the memory of voices that would never speak again. And the mirror. It hung on the far wall, spotted with age, reflecting the room back at itself in muted tones. Dust particles drifted through the weak light filtering from the street, each one visible in the mirror's surface like snow falling upward. But what caught my attention, what made me stop breathing for a moment, were the fingerprints. Dozens of them, pressed into the glass so hard they'd left permanent marks, as if someone had tried to push through to the other side, or hold themselves back from something. This was Oleg Vorin's safe house, or rather, what became of it. The official story, if you can call it that, goes like this. In late November 1988, with the Soviet Empire crumbling like a building whose foundation had turned to sand, Oleg Vasilyevich Vorin, mid-level KGB communications officer, 42 years old, unremarkable in every way that intelligence services measure remarkability, walked into a British consulate in West Berlin and asked for asylum. He brought nothing with him except a leather satchel containing encrypted documents and a photograph of a woman and 2 children. His wife, his daughters, he would never see them again. The British moved him to this apartment. Protocol. Keep him isolated until the debriefing was complete, until they could verify his information, until they decided whether he was genuine or just another false defector, a double agent sent to feed them poisoned intelligence. 3 days later, during a scheduled check-in, the handlers found the door locked from the inside. When they broke through, the apartment was empty. Oleg Vorin had disappeared. That's the official version. Clean, unsatisfying. The kind of story intelligence agencies tell when the truth is either too complicated or too embarrassing to admit. But apartments remember. Objects hold memory better than paper, better than testimony. I moved through the space slowly, cataloging the relics he'd left behind. A Soviet passport, half burned in the kitchen sink, his photograph still visible, serious eyes, thin lips, the look of a man who'd learned to keep his thoughts hidden. Maps of Berlin with certain streets circled in fading red ink. Cipher pads, their pages covered in numbers that meant something once but now were just arithmetic abandoned mid-calculation. A tin of black tea, unopened. A jacket on a hook, one button missing. And on the table beside the mirror, a cassette tape. Someone had labeled it in careful Cyrillic, for when the lights go out. I haven't played it yet. Some doors you open carefully. What we know about Oleg comes in fragments, pieces of a life assembled from file folders and intercepted communications. He was born in Kursk in 1946, educated in Moscow, recruited into the KGB in his early 20s. Not because he was ideologically pure, they were suspicious of those who believed too fervently, but because he was technically competent and emotionally invisible, the perfect gray man. He worked communications, routing encrypted messages between field agents and Moscow center. He saw everything and was meant to notice nothing. But something changed. Maybe he saw too much. Maybe he grew tired of being invisible. Maybe, and this is the theory that keeps me awake some nights, he realized that all the messages he'd been routing, all the intelligence he'd helped transmit, had never changed anything. The Cold War ground on not because of brilliant spies or clever operations, but because of inertia, because stopping required more courage than continuing. The apartment tells a different story than the files do. It speaks of someone who knew he was already dead, who understood that defection wasn't escape but merely a different kind of ending. The fingerprints on the mirror are everywhere, compulsive, repetitive. What was he looking for in his own reflection? What did he ess? That we can't. In the corner, behind a loose section of baseboard, I found something the British handlers must have missed. Letters. 3 of them, written in Russian, addressed to names that don't appear in any database. The handwriting grows more unstable with each one, the lines slanting downward like someone writing in the dark or in despair. The last letter ends mid-sentence. No one knows if Oleg was retrieved by the KGB, silenced by British intelligence to protect some larger operation, or if he simply walked away into the Berlin night and became someone else. The files call him a ghost. The mirror suggests something more complicated, a man who disappeared not into death but into reflection, into the endless recursion of trying to see yourself clearly when clarity itself is the greatest danger. The light is fading now. Evening traffic hums on the street below, ordinary life continuing as it always does, indifferent to the small tragedies that nest in forgotten spaces. I stand before the mirror, my own reflection superimposed over those desperate fingerprints, and wonder if this is what he felt in those last hours. The terrible intimacy of vanishing, of knowing you'll become just another story told by strangers, interpreted and misinterpreted until the truth dissolves into myth. In every ghost story, there's a house that remembers. And this one remembers him. But to understand what haunted Oleg Vorin in those final hours, you have to go back. Back to Moscow in winter, when the city wore its cold like armor. Picture 1984. The breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. Queues for bread stretch around corners, women in headscarves stamping their feet against pavement that hasn't seen the sun in weeks. Gray light filters down over the Lenin mausoleum like judgment. The snow doesn't fall so much as settle, coating everything in a silence that feels enforced. This was the Moscow where Oleg Vorin learned to disappear in plain sight. He came from Minsk, son of a railway worker who died when Oleg was 14. His mother cleaned offices in government buildings, close enough to power to see its mechanisms, far enough to remain invisible. Oleg inherited that invisibility. At university, he studied linguistics and demonstrated something rare, a photographic memory that could reproduce entire pages of text after a single reading. The KGB noticed. They always notice such things. In 1979, he was working for Directorate S, the KGB's illegals program, though he never left Moscow. His job was administrative, clerical, even processing communications, encrypting field reports, managing the endless bureaucratic machinery of espionage. Colleagues described him as a man made of silence. He didn't drink at parties, didn't complain, didn't tell jokes or share grievances. He simply performed his function, perfect and forgettable as a gear in a watch. What changed him? There's rarely one moment is there. More often it's an accumulation, a slow poisoning of faith. But if there was a specific fracture, it came in the winter of 1986. Oleg was processing intelligence from an agent in Bonn, detailed reports about NATO communications infrastructure, solid intelligence, verifiable. His superior, a colonel whose career had stalled years ago and who supplemented his salary through means better left unexamined, altered the report. Changed dates, exaggerated significance, fabricated confirmations. The doctored intelligence would be forwarded to Moscow Center, where it would inform policy decisions, resource allocations, perhaps even military strategies. All of it based on lies designed to make one man look competent. Oleg said nothing. You don't challenge colonels when you're a mid-level officer with no patron, no protection. But cynicism entered him like radiation, slow, invisible, terminal. If this report was falsified, how many others? How much of what he processed daily was performance rather than intelligence? How many decisions at the highest levels were made on foundations of convenient fiction? The ideology he'd never quite believed in, few did by then, not really, collapsed into something worse than disillusionment. It became absurdity. The entire apparatus, the surveillance state, the elaborate cat-and-mouse of Cold War espionage, all of it grinding forward not in service of any principle, but simply because stopping required more courage than continuing. He began noticing other things. Inconsistencies. Gaps. The way certain agents' reports always aligned too perfectly with what Moscow wanted to hear. The way inconvenient truths got buried under procedural delays until they became irrelevant. And so, quietly, carefully, Oleg Vorin made his decision. Not out of love for the West, He harbored no illusions there, but out of something more personal. A desire to break the mirror, to stop being merely a reflection of the system. The contact came through channels I can only piece together from fragments. A professor at Moscow State University who knew someone in the Finnish consulate, who knew someone else. By spring of 1987, Oleg was meeting with a Western intelligence officer known only by the code name Iris. They met at Belorusky Station, under the roar of departing trains, where conversations dissolved into the thunder of engines and the hiss of steam. He would pass tiny film capsules hidden in the seams of his jacket, each one containing photographed documents from his office. Not the dramatic secrets that win wars, but the small corruptions that reveal how power actually operates. The texture of those months, static from hidden radios scanning frequencies, the ritual of tea glasses clinking in communal kitchens where neighbors pretended not to listen, the distant hymn of Moscow's trams cutting through evening fog, and sometimes, 8 at night if you knew where to listen, jazz would leak from underground apartments, contraband American songs of longing and exile, Duke Ellington and Miles Davis playing softly enough not to attract attention, but loud enough to remind you that somewhere beyond the checkpoints and the ideology, people created beauty without permission. What Oleg felt during this period we can only speculate. Relief, terror, perhaps both or neither, perhaps just a sense of falling very slowly, knowing the ground would arrive but not when. History records that the late 1980s saw dozens of small defections across Europe, many undocumented or deliberately obscured. Not the spectacular cases that made headlines, no GRU colonels with suitcases full of secrets, but quiet desertions by people who'd simply stopped believing. The West absorbed some. Others were deemed too unstable, too tainted by their past lives, too psychologically damaged by the act of betrayal itself. These unresolved cases populate margins of declassified files, names without outcomes, stories without endings. Oleg's was one such case. By November 1988, with Glasnost unraveling the Soviet Union from within and the Berlin Wall beginning its metaphorical crumble, Oleg made his final approach. A walk-in at the British consulate in West Berlin requesting asylum. The debriefers remember him clearly, though their descriptions are troubling. One wrote in his report, "Subject appears haunted, cooperative but distracted. During interviews he fixates on mirrors and reflective surfaces. When questioned, he claims something is following him, not a person, but an image of myself I left behind. Recommend psychological evaluation before full clearance granted." Another note, this one from a handler who met him at the safe house. "He never looks at the people before him, always at the mirror behind us. When I asked why, he said, 'In Moscow, I learned to watch reflections. You see betrayals more clearly when you're not looking directly at them.' Cannot determine if this is tradecraft or paranoia." The mirror returns, his fear crystallizing into something beyond rational caution. What was following him? Memory? Guilt? Or something more literal, the sense that in choosing betrayal he'd created a shadow self and that shadow was closing the distance. To cross the line between ideologies was to stop belonging anywhere at all. 3 days after entering British protection, Oleg Vorin vanished. The handlers found the apartment locked from within, the mirror covered with those desperate fingerprints, and nothing else but silence. But that first safe house was not Greybird. Rain against warped glass. The slow moan of a saxophone bleeding through walls from a neighboring bar, some American standard played by someone who learned it from a scratched record, the notes slightly wrong, slightly haunted. This was the sound of the safe house by the river, code-named Greybird, standing on a forgotten stretch of the Spree's east bank where the water moved sluggish and dark. The records are contradictory. Some files say Oleg was moved here in early 1989, after the first disappearance turned out to be a false alarm, that he'd simply walked out for air and gotten lost in the pre-dawn streets. Other documents suggest there were 2 Olegs, 2 defectors whose cases became entangled in the bureaucratic confusion of intelligence services managing too many ghosts. I prefer the first explanation, though I'm no longer certain it matters. In spy stories, facts and legends become indistinguishable after enough time passes. What we know, Greybird was real. is real though condemned now, scheduled for demolition that keeps getting delayed by city bureaucracy and the same inertia that preserves all uncomfortable places. The house had belonged to a poet in the 1950s, a woman named Helene Kirst who wrote verses about divided cities and lovers separated by ideology. She also informed for the Stasi, reporting on fellow artists who spoke too freely after too much wine. When she died in 1976, the house passed through several hands before British intelligence acquired it through a maze of shell companies. It became a transient refuge for people who existed in the margins between intelligence services. Double agents, burned spies, defectors whose information had dried up, those the world preferred to forget. Inside, the house remembers its poet. Faded lilies painted on cracked plaster, their petals curling at the edges where moisture has seeped through. Furniture draped in dust sheets like shrouds, as if someone intended to return but never did. In the basement, a faint power hum that oscillates in a rhythm that shouldn't be possible with modern electrical systems. Local rumor and Berlin traffics heavily in rumor, says the house was built over wartime tunnels, later appropriated by Soviet intelligence for interrogations they preferred not to document. No one has investigated. No one dares. Berlin was a mirror city, one half reflecting the other in a broken pane of ideology. East and West, communist and capitalist, each side creating an inverted image of what it claimed to oppose. And in the seam between them, in the narrow spaces where the reflection fractured, people like Oleg tried to exist. But mirrors, as he well knew, are cruel to those who stare too long. The documents I found at Greybird, scattered across 3 separate archives, deliberately or accidentally incomplete, reconstruct his final movements in fragments. An incomplete field diary kept by one of the handlers records that Oleg arrived on April 12, 1989. The handwriting is careful, bureaucratic. Subject appears stable, cooperative. Requests have been minimal. Then, 3 entries later, subject insists on having mirror from previous safe house transported here. Claims it's a piece of home. Have authorized transfer despite my reservations. Why would a defector want a mirror from his temporary refuge rather than something from his actual home? The handler didn't ask. Or if he did, the question didn't make it into the file. Cigarette. E-butts with Russian filters, found in an ashtray by the window overlooking the Spree. He'd stand there smoking, watching the river carry its dark water toward the Baltic. A Polaroid recovered from behind a radiator shows the Spree at night, streetlights creating halos in the mist rising from the water. On the back, in Cyrillic, everything flows, but where does it go? One of the rotating guards, an MI6 officer named Carver who later left the service and now runs a bookshop in Brighton, gave a statement years after the case was closed. I found him last year, convinced him to talk over tea that had gone cold before either of us noticed. He was always at that mirror, Carver told me. His hands shook slightly, though he was only in his early 60s. Not looking at himself exactly, looking through himself, if that makes sense, and he'd whisper in Russian same phrases over and over. I don't speak the language, but I picked up the cadence, like a prayer or a confession. Once I asked him what he was saying. He looked at me, first time he'd really looked at anyone in days, and said, "I'm apologizing to the man I used to be." The last time the mirror was seen intact was the evening of April 18th. Another guard who refused to give his name filed a brief report, checked on subject at 23:00 hours, found him standing before mirror in darkened room. Mirror surface showed condensation as if from breath, though subject was 3 feet away. When questioned, subject claimed to see movement behind the glass. Advised medical evaluation. Subject refused. By morning, Oleg was gone. The room was locked from the inside, door, windows, all secured. The mirror lay cracked across the floor, a single fissure running from corner to corner as if something had struck it from within. No forced entry. No prints save Oleg's pressed so deeply into the glass shards that they bled. And that smell, multiple people reported it, of ozone and ash, like the aftermath of lightning striking somewhere close but unseen. The official investigation found nothing. The unofficial whispers suggested everything from Soviet extraction to suicide to simple desertion. But none of those explanations account for the mirror, for the impossible condensation, for the blood without a body. Not all vanishings are abductions. Some are reconciliations with the part of ourselves we were told to forget. But reconciliation with what, and at what cost? The answer, or something close to it, lives in a cottage outside Canterbury, where an old man sits surrounded by machines that stopped being relevant decades ago. His name is Peter Holloway, though that might not be the name he was born with. In the intelligence services, names were fluid, conditional. He's 83 now, half-blind from cataracts he refuses to have operated on, and his hands shake when he pours tea. But his memory is sharp as broken glass. I was a radio technician, he tells me, his milky eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder. Signals intelligence. My job was to listen to frequencies that weren't supposed to exist and document what shouldn't be heard. His cottage is a museum of obsolescence. Dusty receivers line the walls, their dials frozen at frequencies no longer in use. Spools of tape marked with codes, Echo 88, Nightjar, Orpheus 12. Papers yellowed with age pile in corners, transcripts of number stations, logs of atmospheric anomalies, reports on Soviet psychological warfare experiments that were themselves experiments in bureaucratic paranoia. They brought me in on the Vorin case April 19, 1989, Peter says. Day after he vanished. Said they needed someone to sweep for listening devices, make sure the safe house was clean. Standard procedure after a disappearance. Check if he'd been transmitting location data, if the Soviets had turned him back, if there was any electronic signature we'd missed. He stands slowly, joints protesting, and shuffles to a shelf where a particular receiver sits, more dust than metal. Beside it, a tape reel marked Echo 88 in fading ink. I found something, he says. A frequency that wasn't supposed to exist, sitting between the shortwave bands in the dead space where nothing broadcasts because nothing can. Like finding a radio station operating in the pause between heartbeats. The Cold War was fought in many theaters, but one of the strangest was the invisible battlefield of radio waves. Number stations, mysterious broadcasts of monotone voices reading strings of numbers, operated throughout the era, their purposes officially unacknowledged but widely understood to be coded messages to field agents. The Soviets had their stations, the West had theirs, and between them a kind of sonic détente where everyone pretended not to notice what everyone knew. But this frequency Peter found was different, not a number station, not any category of broadcast the technical manuals described. Listen, he says, threading the tape onto an ancient reel-to-reel player that shouldn't still work but somehow does. The static rises like cicadas, that particular white noise of radio searching for signal. Beneath it, barely audible, rhythmic pulses, not quite Morse code, not quite random. A pattern that sounds, and I know how absurd this will seem, like breathing. Slow inhalations and exhalations translated into electromagnetic wavelengths. He found a way to talk to mirrors, Peter says. His voice drops to something between revelation and confession. Not glass ones, the kind made of air, radio mirrors, layers of ionosphere that reflect signals back to Earth. During the Cold War, both sides bounced encrypted transmissions off them, but Oleg, he trails off, searching for words. Oleg learned to make them answer. I don't interrupt. You don't interrupt when someone is trying to explain the impossible. The recordings we made that night, April 19th, they contained something no one at MI6 could account for. A voice. Clear as anything despite the frequency being technically unusable for voice transmission. And it was him. Voice analysis confirmed it was Oleg Vorin. Only problem, we recorded this 3 hours after he'd already vanished. In the dim amber light of Peter's cottage, surrounded by the relics of an obsolete trade, I listened to the tape again. The breathing pattern continues, and then faint but distinct words in Russian. The same phrase repeated with the obsessive precision of a mantra or a prayer. Yadam, Yadam, Yadam. I am home, I am home, I am home. But where is home for a man who's defected from on? E-system and not yet been absorbed into another. A man caught between ideologies, between languages, between the person he was and the person he might become. The official explanation, Peter continues, was that I'd picked up a pre-recorded message, something Oleg had said on a timer before he disappeared, but that doesn't explain the gaps. He rewinds the tape, plays it again. Between the repetitions of Yadamoy there are pauses, and in those pauses, if you listen closely, if you let yourself hear it, there's something that sounds like another voice responding. Too faint to make out words, just the shape of speech, the cadence of conversation. He was talking to someone, Peter says, or to himself, or to whatever lived in that frequency between frequencies. Historical records document numerous psychological warfare experiments during the late Cold War. Both sides tested subliminal messaging, acoustic weapons, attempts to use radio waves to induce altered states of consciousness. The CIA's Project MK Ultra is well documented. The Soviet equivalent programs less so, but they existed. Perhaps Oleg, with his background in communications and his photographic memory, had been exposed to something, some technique, some technology, that allowed him to broadcast himself into the spaces between signals. Or perhaps, and Peter seems to believe this, Oleg discovered that betrayal creates its own frequency. That when you turn against everything you were trained to be, when you step across that invisible line between ideologies, you begin broadcasting on a wavelength only other exiles can hear. In 1996, Peter tells me, some kids urban exploring in East Berlin found a cache of Soviet monitoring equipment in an abandoned Stasi building. Among the recovered materials, recordings of the same frequency I'd picked up, same voice, same phrase, but dated 3 months after Oleg's disappearance. The Soviets were listening too. They heard him wherever he was still transmitting. The rain has started outside, tapping against the cottage windows like static made solid. Distant thunder rolls through the Kent countryside, echoing the low-frequency hum that seems to emanate from Peter's collection of dead machines. Perhaps he found a frequency no border could silence. Perhaps in learning to watch mirrors, to see betrayal in reflection rather than face it directly, Oleg also learned to become a reflection himself. Not physical, not quite real, but present in the way radio waves are present, invisible, penetrating everywhere and nowhere. The tape continues, the breathing pattern, the voice repeating its simple truth, I am home. But home, I'm beginning to understand, wasn't a place Oleg could reach by crossing borders or seeking asylum. Home was a frequency, a wavelength, a space between spaces where the man he was could finally meet the man he'd become and maybe, finally, make peace. The static rises, falls, rises again like breath, like prayer, like the oscillation between past and present, between belief and madness, between the documented and the dreamed. Yadam, the voice says one final time before the tape runs out. And in the silence that follows, something, maybe just the house settling, maybe just my imagination, answers. The answer leads backward, always backward, through layers of classified history that smell of mildew and redacted ink. To understand what happened to Oleg Vorin requires understanding what was done to him long before he ever stepped into that safe house by the spree. The archival reels are stamped CCCP 1973 from the Institute of Applied Radiophysics in Gorky, a city closed to foreigners where science bent toward purposes the world wasn't meant to see. The paper is brittle, the typewritten text spotted with age, but the words remain, Project Zerkalo, mirror. The Soviets believed that mirrors could store more than reflections. It sounds like folklore, like something from a grandmother's cautionary tale. But the documentation is extensive, technical, filled with equations I can barely follow and diagrams that make my eyes hurt to examine too closely. The theoretical foundation was quantum optical memory, the idea that certain materials under specific conditions could record and retain electromagnetic impressions. Not images exactly, something subtler. The residual traces of consciousness, the faint signatures left by human presence. The researchers claimed that mirrored glass, when properly treated with rare earth elements and subjected to precise electromagnetic fields, could capture these impressions and, under the right circumstances, replay them. Like a record, but for something that had never been sound or light to begin with. Most of these experiments vanished into classified archives after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. Perhaps the radiation paranoia consumed them. Perhaps someone in Moscow realized the program had crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed, but fragments survive, scattered across 3 continents, discovered by researchers who knew where not to look. Blueprints for a portable reflection array, small enough to fit in a diplomatic case. Person. NEL files for scientists tagged as relocated, the euphemism they used, or simply deceased with no date, no cause. Equipment manifests showing specialized mirrors transferred to Berlin between 1984 and 1988, routed through Directorate S, the KGB's illegals program that Oleg had worked for. And among those files, buried in a list of approved personnel, Oleg Vasilievich Vorin, designated as an authorized transmitter. What did that mean? The documents don't explain. They never do, not fully. But other files, requisitions, training logs, medical evaluations, sketch the outline of something deeply strange. The program involved exposing soldiers and intelligence operatives to specially constructed mirrored chambers. Not for interrogation, though that would have been disturbing enough. For what the documents called resonance conditioning, training subjects to amplify their auditory perception of distant frequencies, to hear across distances that physics claimed were impossible. The theory, as I understand it from papers published years later under different names in obscure journals, was that human consciousness operates on measurable frequencies, and that if you could train someone to resonate with those frequencies, to become, in effect, a kind of living antenna, they might be able to pick up signals from other consciousness-resonant sources. Other people, other minds. The practical application for espionage is obvious. Imagine an agent who could sense surveillance, who could detect the presence of hostile operatives by the frequency of their attention. Imagine a communications officer who could verify the psychological state of field agents without any physical contact, who could tell if someone had been compromised just by listening to the silence between their words. But the side effects were worse than anyone anticipated. Subjects reported hearing echoed selves, their own voices speaking from some other place or time, saying things they didn't remember saying or hadn't said yet. Some described conversations with people who weren't there or who hadn't been there in years. The psychological toll was severe. Of the 47 subjects documented in the surviving files, 12 were hospitalized for acute psychotic episodes. 5 took their own lives. The rest were reassigned to duties that kept them far from mirrors, far from the equipment that had opened whatever frequency they'd learned to hear. The program was officially discontinued in 1984. Unofficially, it continued in modified form, with more careful screening, with subjects chosen for their psychological resilience, or their psychological peculiarities. People who already lived between frequencies, who already understood how to be multiple selves at once. People like Oleg Vorin, who'd spent his career processing messages from ghosts, who'd learned to see betrayal in reflections rather than face it directly. I'm standing in the ruined safe house now, Greybird, where the air tastes of rain and decay. My flashlight catches the shattered mirror fragments scattered across the floor like broken constellation. The air carries a fine metallic tang, like old electricity, like the moment before lightning strikes, like the smell that lingers in places where too much voltage has passed through too little space. I kneel beside the largest fragment, perhaps a foot across, still bearing those desperate fingerprints pressed deep into the silvered backing. The glass is cold, colder than the room's ambient temperature can account for. And for just a moment, a heartbeat, maybe two, the reflection shimmering across its surface flickers. Shows not my face, not the modern room with its peeling walls and accumulated silence. Shows a man standing in the same space but 36 years earlier, dark hair, hollow eyes looking back at me with an expression I can't quite read, recognition, warning, relief. The image vanishes before I can be certain it was ever there. But the metallic taste intensifies, and beneath the sound of my own breathing, beneath the distant traffic and the rain against broken windows, I hear something that might be whispers, layered, overlapping like multiple recordings playing at once. Russian words I almost understand, frequencies I almost recognize. Whether the experiments worked or merely worked on those who believed in them, Oleg became their last reflection. A man who learned to broadcast himself across wavelengths that shouldn't exist, who found a way to step through the mirror into a space where borders meant nothing because space itself meant nothing. But stepping through a mirror means leaving your body behind. And what remains is something between memory and echo, neither quite alive nor quite gone. The reel-to-reel machine shouldn't still work. It's been sitting in Greybird's basement for over 3 decades, its motor seized with rust, its tape heads corroded. Yet when I return the following morning, drawn back by questions I can't answer, I hear it. A soft mechanical click, the whisper of tape beginning to move, threading itself through capstans that haven't turned since 1989. I don't remember turning it on. I'm certain I didn't. The voice that emerges from the ancient speakers is calm, almost resigned, speaking Russian with the careful enunciation of someone who knows he's recording for posterity, or for people who will need to understand across the barrier of time. A house remembers what it was built to contain, Oleg's voice says. The recording quality is poor, degraded by years of magnetic decay, but his words are clear. 47 meters from the eastern wall, depth of 12, where water runs beneath stone. That's where they kept the first mirror. That's where I learned to see backward. The words sound like poetry or madness or coded intelligence depending on how you listen to them. I transcribe everything, taking notes with hands that shake slightly. The recording continues for 7 minutes, Oleg's voice weaving between Russian and German, between coordinates and philosophical fragments, between confession and instruction. When the tape ends, it rewinds itself. I let it. The coordinates, when plotted on modern maps cross-referenced with Cold War-era infrastructure blueprints, point to a location beneath the Spree, a disused storm tunnel system built in the 1960s as part of Berlin's civil defense network. Access was sealed after reunification, the entrances filled with concrete, the tunnels officially forgotten. But intelligence services don't forget. They simply declassify in their own time. It takes 3 days to arrange access, to navigate the bureaucracy of a city that's still discovering what lies beneath its streets. When we finally descend, myself, 2 structural engineers, and a historian from the Stasi Records archive, the air tastes of rust and river water. Our lights cut through darkness that's been absolute for 30 years. The tunnel extends further than the original plans indicated. Branches lead to branches, some collapsed, others merely waiting. We follow Oleg's coordinates like a treasure map drawn by someone who wanted to be found, but only by those willing to search in the right darkness. And then we find it. The mirror room. Someone, Soviet intelligence, most likely, during the years when East Berlin was their laboratory, had constructed a chamber 30 feet beneath the Spree. The walls are covered in reflective foil, the kind used in legitimate acoustic research, but arranged in a pattern that suggests different purposes. Every surface throws back light, multiplies it, creates infinite regress of reflection. Standing in the center feels like standing inside a prism or a trap or both. Remnants of Cold War surveillance equipment line the floor. Wiring snakes through conduits in the ceiling, leading to recording devices that no longer function, or shouldn't function. There's a chair in the center, metal, bolted to the floor, facing a larger mirror panel that somehow remained intact despite the moisture and time. This was an interrogation room, or a testing facility, or some hybrid of both, where the line between extracting information and extracting identity became meaningless. Jesus, one of the engineers whispers. His voice multiplies across the reflective surfaces, coming back to us from a dozen directions at once, slightly delayed, slightly wrong. My recording equipment, body mic, digital recorder, backup phone, begins picking up something unexpected. Modulated feedback that shouldn't be possible in this space. Not random static, patterns, rhythmic pulses that sound like breathing. Syncopated beats that match human heartbeats but slightly offset, as if recorded from a body whose heart beat at a different tempo than ours. And beneath it all, almost subliminal, fragments of a Russian lullaby. The same melody I heard in the apartment, in part 1 of this investigation, humming from some lost recording. Bayushki bayu, bye bye bye. The historian, a woman named Christina who spent her career documenting Stasi psychological operations, plays back her recording. The feedback is louder, clearer, not interference, presence. "This is impossible," she says, but her voice lacks conviction. She's read too many files, seen too much documentation of experiments that violated everything we understand about possible. Perhaps Oleg didn't vanish into a mirror. Perhaps the mirror was the last doorway that reflected him twice, once here, in this world of flesh and surveillance, once elsewhere, in a frequency only mirrors can access. Perhaps he learned to exist in both places simultaneously, or neither, or in the space between reflection and reality where borders dissolve. My flashlight beam wavers. I steady it, but the waver continues. And in that moment I see the lens of my phone camera catch its own flare, but doubled. Two bright spots offset by a split second, as if the light traveled to the lens twice, taking different routes through time. The echo motif that's followed this investigation from the beginning intensifies. Footsteps behind us repeat before they happen. We hear them, turn to look, then take the steps that create the sound we've already heard. Time doesn't loop exactly. It stutters, hiccups. The reflective surfaces seem to be storing moments and replaying them out of sequence, creating a space where causality becomes negotiable. The engineers want to leave. I don't blame them. But I move to the center of the room, to the metal chair, and sit where Oleg must have sat dozens of times during whatever conditioning or testing or communion happened in this underground cathedral of reflection. Around me, infinite copies of myself stare back, but one, just one, in the far corner of the largest mirror panel, doesn't move when I move, sits still, looks at me with an expression I recognize from photographs. The dripping water, condensation from the river seeping through ancient concrete, keeps time like a failing clock. All other sound fades to near silence. Just the drops, just my breathing, just the hum of something that isn't electricity but might be frequency itself, the bass resonance of a space that's been tuned to wavelengths human ears weren't meant to hear. He stepped into the one place that never betrays us, our own reflection. The one space where truth is absolute because it can only show what already exists, unless you learn to show it what could exist. What does exist in frequencies we can't see? My flashlight. GHT flickers once, twice, goes dark. The emergency lights from the tunnel entrance should still be visible, but they're not. Just darkness, just the hum. Just the sense that I'm not alone in this reflection chamber, that something or someone shares this space between mirrors, neither fully here nor fully gone. Only the hum remains. And then light, not my flashlight returning, but the emergency lights from the tunnel entrance finally finding their way through the darkness. The engineers are calling my name, their voices distant and worried. I've been in the mirror room for 17 minutes, though it felt like seconds or hours or both. When I emerge, Berlin is waiting, always rebuilding. Morning breaks pale gold over the mist rising from the spree. The safe house stands empty, already wearing the temporary fencing that marks buildings scheduled for demolition. By autumn, it will be apartments, expensive ones, marketed to young professionals who want to live in historic neighborhoods without knowing too precisely what that history entails. The estate agent's sign promises luxury living in the heart of reunified Berlin, with no mention of the poet informant who died here, or the defector who vanished, or the mirrors that might still be watching. I stand across the street, drinking coffee that's gone cold, and think about residue. Every empire leaves residue. The Romans left aqueducts and roads. The Ottomans left mosques and bathhouses. The British left railroads threading through continents they'd convinced themselves needed them. But the Cold War, that strange, undeclared conflict fought in frequencies and false identities and ideologies that ate their believers from within, left something different. Black dust in sealed archives, silent walls that heard too much and said nothing, forgotten codes that still transmit from transmitters that no longer exist, and ghosts woven into the very airwaves, broadcasting their presence on wavelengths only the initiated can hear. I've spent 6 months investigating Oleg Vorin's disappearance, and I'm no closer to knowing what happened to him than I was the day I found that apartment behind its bricked-over entrance. But I understand something more important now. The question itself is the haunting. Berlin moves around me with the industrious amnesia of cities that have been destroyed and rebuilt too many times to hold grudges. Riverboats cut through morning fog on the spree. Construction cranes pivot against gray sky, building tomorrow's skyline over yesterday's ruins. Tourists pose for photographs at Checkpoint Charlie, that theatrical remnant of a border that once divided not just a city, but an entire conception of what it meant to be human. And beneath it all, if you know how to listen, radio chatter persists from lost number stations. Those mysterious broadcasts that define the Cold War, strings of numbers read by monotone voices, messages for agents in the field, codes that no one admits existed. Most went silent when the wall fell. But some frequencies never quite stopped transmitting. Peter Holloway sent me recordings last month. New ones, captured by amateur radio enthusiasts who scan the bands looking for ghosts. Among the static and the interference from commercial broadcasts and the digital noise of our hyperconnected age, a recurring pattern emerges. Simple, repetitive, familiar. Oleg's lullaby, Bayashki Bayu, bye bye bye, but transformed now into binary signal tones, dots and dashes that aren't quite Morse code, pulses that match no known encryption standard. No one knows where it transmits from. Triangulation attempts fail. It seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, like trying to pinpoint the source of an echo in a room made entirely of mirrors. The emotional core of this story isn't the espionage or the experiments or even the supernatural suggestions that have threaded through this investigation. It's the photograph I found in the safe house, tucked behind that loose baseboard along with the letters that ended mid-sentence. Oleg's wife, his daughters, black and white, corners soft with handling. The woman's face is strong, Slavic cheekbones and serious eyes that stare at the camera at her absent husband with an expression that breaks my heart every time I look at it. Not anger, not even sadness exactly, just a kind of horizonless waiting, the look of someone who knows she won't receive answers but can't stop searching for them anyway. They were never reunited. Soviet records show his family was relocated after his defection, moved from Moscow to a town near the Urals whose name was removed from public maps. His wife died in 2003. One daughter emigrated to Israel. The other married, changed her name, disappeared into the vast anonymity of post-Soviet life. None of them ever learned what happened to Oleg. Perhaps that's mercy. Perhaps it's the cruelest thing the Cold War could have done to them, leaving them with questions that have no answers because the answer itself has become a frequency, a reflection, a ghost that broadcasts but never arrives. The mirror, those shattered pieces covered in desperate fingerprints, is now boxed for storage in the Berlin Museum of Industrial History. They won't display it. Too obscure, too unsettling, too difficult to explain without. Sounding like you're promoting conspiracy theories, but the curator let me photograph it before it was sealed. In those photographs, taken with a phone camera that shouldn't have captured anything unusual, I can see the filming crew reflected in the fragments. But some of the reflections are multiplied, doubled, as if the past were still recording through the glass, as if the mirror were still trying to complete whatever transmission Oleg began but never finished. He was never found. His body was never recovered. No intelligence service, East or West, has ever admitted knowing what happened in that safe house in April 1989. The official file remains classified until 2064, by which time everyone involved will be dead, and the truth will matter only to historians and the ghosts who live in frequencies we've forgotten how to hear. But perhaps that was his intention all along. Perhaps defection wasn't about reaching the West. It was about escaping the binary, East or West, Soviet or capitalist, traitor or patriot, and finding a third space that exists only in reflection, only in the wavelengths between stations, only in the questions that have no answers because they're designed to be eternal. Some ghosts do not haunt places, they haunt questions. And the mirror keeps asking,